So first I get to introduce the panel members, and then I will turn it over to our moderator, who is the first person I'll introduce, Keishia Facey. Keishia is an international speaker and facilitator whose commitment to dismantle anti-Black racism meets at the intersections of social justice, Black joy, empowerment, and healing. As a program manager of One Vision, One Voice at the Ontario Association of Children's Aid Societies, Keishia leads the development of policies and strategies to address the anti-Black racism that is embedded within the child welfare sector. Thank you, Keishia, if you want to give a little wave. We also will have on the panel Shaoli Chowdhury joining us from Vancouver. Shaoli is an experienced advocate for the safety and well-being of women with a passion for advancement of migrant and newcomer women's rights. She is the manager of transition houses at YWCA Metro Vancouver, overseeing 3 transition houses in Vancouver. Shaoli has worked with teens experiencing sexual violence on crisis lines, and now with single mothers fleeing abuse in their lives. Shaoli hopes her career continues to support women on their path towards safety, independence, and lives free from violence. Welcome, Shaoli. I'll next introduce Monica Lairos. Monica was born and raised in Mexico and has been permanently established in Edmonton, Canada since 2015. Since 2020, Monica has been a peer champion with the Ontario Council of Agencies Serving Immigrants, supporting immigrant women with information, processes, sharing her experiences, and providing emotional support. Monica is an English as a second language student as part of a university upgrading program and hopes to pursue paralegal studies diploma and law school in the future. Welcome, Monica. And then Travonne Edwards is a third-year PhD candidate at the Factor-Inwentash Faculty of Social Work. So I get to see sometimes Travonne in the halls at the University of Toronto. Travonne is an experienced critical youth worker with a demonstrated history of working in child welfare and protection, in education and supportive housing for youth experiencing homelessness. His research aims to understand how Black communities experience state systems. He's currently conducting research led by Black community with One Vision, One Voice to address the overrepresentation and disparities faced by Black Canadians in child welfare. And then last but not least, introducing, very happy to have Mary Birdsell, the Executive Director of Justice for Children and Youth Clinic. It's a legal clinic dedicated to advancing the legal and human rights of children and youth in Ontario. Since 1996, Mary has been a tireless advocate for individual young people facing significant adversity through direct legal representation, test case litigation, public legal education, community development, systemic law reform, and mentoring and supporting child rights advocates in her office and beyond. Mary has been instrumental in increasing access to justice for children and youth, including for homeless and unstably housed young people, through the creation of JFCY's innovative Street Youth Legal Services Program. Welcome, Mary and all. And I will now turn it over to Keishia.
Thank you very much, Rupalim, and to everybody at the Bordering Practices Project. Thank you so much for inviting me to be here to moderate this discussion with these wonderful panelists. I'm very excited to be here. So I heard earlier people, I'm not sure who that was, I believe it was Mandeep, mentioning being first-generation Canadian or second-generation Canadian. I can't remember what she had said, but I am first-generation Canadian here as well, and I'm really excited to be a part of a discussion that really focuses on the immigration experience for those of us, particularly who hold racialized identities as well, because we know that there's a lot of overlap in terms of the systems and the sectors and impacting the outcomes that we're seeing. So being able to be part of the discussion and hear from such wonderful panelists, I think is going to really make for some great relationships and moving this work forward in a really positive way. So for me, the Bordering Practice Project and this collaborative discussion builds upon the importance of looking at how disparate outcomes are maintained across systems, and in particular as community members navigate collective spaces such as settlement services and immigration status, as Rupalim had mentioned. So at this time, I would like to invite our panelists to introduce themselves, also to share, why they're here and what has propelled them to be a part of this discussion here today. So I would like to start with Travonne, if you don't mind. Over to you, Travonne.
Hi everyone, my name is Travonne Edwards, and as mentioned before, I'm a PhD student at the University of Toronto in the Faculty of Social Work. And what brings me here is I have a deep, deep passion for working alongside and with Black communities. And right now has been a more pressing time than ever. And I really believe that we're all doing amazing things. And I'm hoping that these conversations will lead to ways that we can harmonize our work and bring everyone in motion towards larger structural change. So that's just me in short, and I'm happy to be here.
Thank you so much, Travonne. Mary?
Hi there, I'm Mary Birdsell. I'm a lawyer and the executive director at the Legal Clinic Justice for Children and Youth. And so we're really honored to be able to participate in the research project and learn and grow in that context, and very happy to be here today. I think that sometimes the unique circumstance of young people who might often be dealing with multiple systems kind of on their own, as opposed to what we sometimes think of as a more sort of common family unit, creates some unique circumstances for those young people, and really often systems are not set up. Child welfare system, immigration system, education system, and many others to address those unique needs that young people might bring to the table as sort of on their own footing. And then, of course, when you combine that with all the other kinds of barriers or adversities that people face, including trauma, systemic trauma from racism and other kinds of things, you really have a complicated mix. And I just echoing what Travonne said, I think that a time in our development when we are looking at breaking down some of those silos is a really important moment. I am a settler Canadian, and but I think it's really important that we all think about ourselves in a migration context, especially in a country like Canada, which, as Rupali sort of described as a colonial project, because we're all newcomers in a way, maybe just some a little less new than others. Anyway, I'm thrilled to be here and honored to be on this panel, so thank you.
Thank you so much, Mary, and welcome. Monica.
Hello, everyone. I'm very happy to be here. I'm very honored to share with you my experiences as a woman who experienced gender-based violence and also family violence. Also, I was involved with the child welfare system. And right now, I'm very passionate about supporting and helping other women, not only to learn, but also to show them that you can overcome all those issues and you can be legal and happy in Canada. Thank you.
Thank you, Monica. Welcome. And last but not least, Shaoli.
Hi, thank you. My name is Shaoli and I'm based out of Vancouver. I work for the YWCA, managing second stage transition houses, which is kind of the middle stage before women move on to long-term independent housing, which means that they're just able to stay with us for up to a year and access some supports, because we recognize that they're usually in a pretty tough time in their life, and that systems are not set up to ensure that they're able to access what they need in that time. My interest in this project is twofold. The first is that I'm the child of immigrants. And so from the jump, I've had an interest in the immigrant experience. And then I have a very professional investment as well in the work that I do. So many of the women that I work with are racialized migrants who are really, 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 truly incredible in their own right. And it's an honor to be able to work alongside them. And it's also devastating to work alongside them, to see them go through systems that are just not built to support them. And so I have a couple different points of interest, and I'm just really excited and honored to be here and learn alongside another incredible set of panelists. Yeah, thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Shaoli. Okay, so in the interest of time, I think we're just gonna get right into the questions. So the first question that we have is actually for Travonne. So in recent years, child welfare systems across Canada have received increased scrutiny for their complicity in cultural genocide against Indigenous communities and systemic forms of anti-Black racism that lead to disproportionate numbers of Indigenous and Black children and youth in care. So our question for you is, why is an anti-Black racism lens important to help us understand the experience of Black, Caribbean, and African families who are involved in the child welfare system?
Thanks, Keishia. I believe an anti-Black racism lens is important because issues of anti-Black racism often flourish largely when it's unacknowledged. Anti-Black racism is perpetuated by the state, and it's significantly unacknowledged, though there's been a considerable breadth of Black scholarship and community advocacy that has brought awareness to these issues. The extensive history of anti-Black racism in Canada is often met with critiques and even denial of its existence. And this leads to Black communities being an alienated group and continuously under that erasure. And as we know, a history that goes unacknowledged is often a history that is doomed to be repeated. The impacts of slavery are pervasive, and its aftermaths have manifested in the form of structural anti-Black racism that specifically shapes how Black Canadians experience and navigate these institutions and systems. Issues of disproportionality and disparity are historically rooted in these systems, and I believe previous efforts have failed to adequately address them because they're often untethered from this history. Without acknowledging the role of slavery, context and information will always be missing. The oppression of Black people, like now in today's days, has morphed in complex ways that's now being rationalized as colorblindness. And these ways are often quite difficult to detect and combat. Colorblindness is often seen as a form of race neutrality, objectivity, or race should not be considered. But these concepts of neutrality and objectivities in macro level policy often omits and misrepresents the realities of Black communities and their relationship with the state. Like I said, white supremacy and anti-Black racism fuels more efficiently when it's concealed in these ideas of neutrality and objectivity, and concentrates on family level deficiencies and subjects Black families to anti-Black racism and other forms of oppressions. Anti-Black racism plays a historical and continual role in reversing society's perspective around who's inflicting violence and who is actually the violence is being perpetuated against. Institutions often benevolently aim to do well, but don't take accountability for these historic and ongoing violences against Black communities. So even though state has legitimized racism, such as slavery, segregation, discrimination, and policies, these have been justified for centuries, which has then led to tremendous impacts on the overall health and well-being of Black communities, who are then held responsible for these residual effects of violence. Existence as a Black person in Canada in contemporary times is to live in the aftermath of slavery, which exposes us to inequitable access to services, schooling, poverty, policing, and disproportionate contact to the child welfare system. Without a critical consideration of the systemic impacts of structural anti-Black racism, prior to being referred to the child welfare system, they will always continue to be policed, pathologized, and punished for the circumstances created by racism itself.
Thank you so much, Travonne. A quick follow-up question. So you say that is to live in the aftermath of slavery. So as a follow-up question to that, what are some of the similarities or differences when considering how systemic racism impacts racialized immigrants in general? For example, in terms of police involvement or child welfare investigations?
So I would say overall, the child welfare system operates and is situated in like a Western Eurocentric belief system, which often clashes with the ways in which parentings from Black families and other racialized communities practice. And some of the similarities in regard to systemic racism include that strained relationship with the child welfare system due to the rigidness of their practices and their inability to customize approaches to meet the unique cultural and racial ideologies of the parents. Cultural and racial misunderstandings account for some of the allegations and substantiations of abuse pinned against parents. In other instances, where it's reversed, where parents do not understand Canada has a particular perspective on what it means to be an effective parent that veers from how things are done or performed in their country of origin. There's actually qualitative research that talks from the perspective of child welfare workers that explains immigrant and newcomer families are often at higher odds of coming into contact with the child welfare system due to the lack of information pertaining to laws that guide the system in Ontario. And mothers ultimately felt that their parenting beliefs were being interrogated and misinterpreted. Other things that contribute is mental health services are often not culturally appropriate or curated, which exacerbate families' needs and drive contact to the system. And also caseworkers articulate that newcomers often do not have the community supports or networks, which may worsen issues of isolation, employment, and feed their contact with the system.
Thank you, Travonne. Did anybody else in the audience have any questions directly related to Travonne and his responses? I think Bilkis, we're looking out for any hands that might be raised, yes?
Yep, thanks, Keishia. No hands yet, but we can keep going and I'll let you know.
Thank you. So Travonne, actually, I had one follow-up question. You mentioned the denial of existence of anti-Black racism. What are some examples? What are some ways that we see that denial, right? Like, 'cause at this point, you know, we've talked about anti-Black racism. We know there's been this supposed racial awakening where people are a little bit more aware. How does the denial still present itself?
It manifests in a couple of ways. One I would say is through state legislation and policy. When you look through, for example, the Child and Youth Family Service Act, it's often a very colorblind and neutral document that doesn't even acknowledge the fact that Black families have, one, experienced slavery in Canada, two, have an ongoing history of oppression with the states, and three, the document itself doesn't actually use the word Black, African, or any of these homogenizing terms to talk about our community at whole. So these are one of the ways in which, like, it constantly goes unacknowledged, absent, and we know there's a history of erasure, right? I know in the States right now, there's a whole politic around the theory of critical race theory and how this is being trying to be debunked. We know that in literary devices in Canada, particularly in the education system, there's been erasures of Black history and slavery in textbooks. So these are ways that these things constantly feed the unawareness or the ignorance towards ABR as a phenomenon for Black communities.
Thank you, Travonne. Do any of the other panelists feel to respond to Travonne's responses or have any questions for Travonne specifically, or comments or reflections? You got a lot of lists, you got lots of options there.
Thank you so much, Travonne. I am really so interested in, and really what you said about the cultural competence, or I guess cultural humility, when women are accessing services in terms of like understanding different cultural ideas of parenting is so interesting to me, and will come up for me as well. But we see that a lot, you know, and I think that there are other conversations in terms of like, for a lot of newcomers, like how does trauma manifest and like how does that affect people's ability to parent? Because the conversation is never that, you know, immigrants are all incredible parents and none can be abusive. That's such a reductive, unfortunate generalization. The ask is really like, how can we culturally understand like what is people's relationship to parenting, and like how can we support them through trying to become a better parent if that's, you know, what they're capable of in the moment. So I thought that was really interesting and is directly related to my work, because I'm selfishly just wanted to bring that up.
That's wonderful. Thank you, Shaoli. Mary, Monica, also wanted to create some space if you had any comments or feedback that you wanted to add.
I just sort of say a thanks to the recognition that, you know, there's this whole critique that you really thoroughly encapsulated in a really short period of time, though, around law being neutral on its face. And I think the child welfare system is a really great example of where what's there as a structural overlay because of legislation and policy and sort of government approach, and what actually happens for people on the ground is so, there's such a huge discrepancy sometimes. And it's a really big challenge for all of us, whether we work in the law or sort of adjacent or outside it, to really come to understand that the reality of how things work really needs to feed how we structure things in the first place, as opposed to the other way around. So I just appreciate noting that.
Thank you, Mary. All right, we have 2 questions and then we'll move on to the next question for our next panelist. So we'll hear from Liliana.
Hi, hello, I'm an MSW student from Windsor University, and I think one of the biggest barriers would be not only what's embedded in the policies and in the infrastructure of services as is right now, as he was mentioning, but also the assumption that no one can question that, that processes as they are assumed to be correct. So really, I think our work has to start by challenging those assumptions in just the simple ways of how we treat people, how we connect with people. And I think that's being a big challenge. We attribute that to the culture of any organization. Well, let's assume that culture is not really servicing the community. Just contemplate that. I think for me, that's an aspect that has not been contemplated.
Thank you so much, Liliana. And we're going to have some more time towards the end of the panel discussion to really take up some of those questions and those comments. So I've made a note of it, and I think all the panelists have as well, and hopefully they'll be able to speak into what you just mentioned. But we're going to move on to our next question, which is directed towards Mary. And it's about the invisibility of immigration status and child welfare. So one of the key concerns in our project is the growing number of immigrants in Canada who are not citizens and have a precarious status, including temporary foreign workers, international students, refugee claimants, and people who are undocumented. Despite this growing population, we have found continued silence or lack of information about immigration status and child welfare. So our question to you is, what do you think contributes to the lack of attention to immigration status in child welfare organizations?
Okay, thank you. Tiny little question. I'll just wrap it up in a second or two here. I think I wanted to highlight for today's purposes and coming from my perspective, a couple things. I think someone in the chat just mentioned or made the comment that the child welfare system tends to be entirely adversarial. And I think that's really connected to some of the things that Travonne said about the Eurocentric approach, a sort of a colonial approach, and even like the recognized piece where in law we see the notion that if child protection services or child welfare services are involved, it's an intrusion into the family by the state. So it's this very separate kind of idea where you've got the state actor and the family who, when they fail, as a sort of structural reality within the system, then we come in and we take over and we do what we want, instead of anything that really resembles. And I think there are many movements in terms of trying to resolve that sort of just intrusive, powerful dynamic, but that powerful dynamic exists for certain, and the sea change that's really needed to a place where what we see out of child protection or child welfare services might be a really supportive thing that would come in and ask parents and children alike, what is it that you need? How can we make the situation better for you? What resources are you shy of? What healing do you need? How can we as a society and as an agency support healing and better health and well-being? So I think that really, and I think there are many ways of describing it, but it's undoubtedly Eurocentric, it's undoubtedly colonial, and it's undoubtedly about power and control instead of community involvement and really, meeting people where they're at, identifying their self-identified needs and responding to that in meaningful and supportive ways. And so part of that is this very siloed approach where immigration is an issue and a thing that's over here. It's all about law, and child welfare is this other thing, and it's all over here, and education and mental health and so forth and so on. So I think one of the reasons that in the child welfare system, there's just a real lack of attention to immigration questions is partly, at least, connected to this siloed approach. I think the other thing is that there are many pieces in that siloed approach that make integration and better sort of holistic approaches really complicated, because there are these little pieces, for instance, and I'm going to go from the big picture to the very small picture, but at one time, children, for instance, if they were unaccompanied minors, which is a whole thing we could talk about, but might have had a path to citizenship or more stable immigration status. But when they are in what we now call in Ontario extended care, the legal parent isn't a person who can sign a form. So there are these mundane minutiae that we allow to create barriers that we don't seek to overcome. And I would say that the other piece of that is that you know, the individual folks who are working in child protection and child welfare who, you know, with all of their great intentions are overworked and overstressed. And so that gets to my next sort of category of things that I think inhibit this integration of these two questions, which is the prioritization and the sort of sense of urgency about what's important. And so in the most dramatic circumstance where you have a child who's really you know, facing harm or you know, some kind of stress and difficulty, you know, maybe their physical health and well-being, maybe some basic stabilization around, you know, nutrition, roof over the head, some of these basic kinds of things, education. There are so many things that might be important in terms of trying to provide care that immigration really falls off the list because it's not urgent in the most obvious way. And then to me, that's another segue into another thing that I think is really important on a different spectrum of child welfare involvement. And that is two parts to that. One is the sense of who's responsible. So we have this very, very weird, complicated, actually, you know, conflicting view about like the state is that I was talking about before is going to come in and is going to, you know, take over the looking after of children when parents are failing, and they're going to do a certain number of things. They're not going to do all these other things, back to the silo connection, and yet, you know, trying to stabilize somebody's immigration status and ensure that they have maximum options as they grow and develop and potentially reach out or inevitably reach adulthood. You know, those things are sort of too complex. So we're not dealing with that. We're just going to focus on the adversarial system. We're going to focus on the legal pieces and whatnot. And so we leave it to, you know, potentially the parent from whom we are taking all of this sort of control and participation. And so there's this idea about who's going to do what and how that's going to happen. And as I say each of these things, you know, I'm sort of making what I think are segues, but I really think these are intersecting things that are not in a line, they're in a circle, and really they're much more of a web. And so the last thing I'd like to just highlight is lack of knowledge. And this is a little bit more relevant maybe in the context that I work in, which is mostly older children and mostly children who are, and when I say children, I mean anybody up to 18, who are coming to us individually. So they're you know, sort of independent for some reason or another. And often we are meeting with young people who don't know what their immigration status is. They don't know what steps adults may or may not have taken along the way. And so and sorry, I missed one thing that I meant to say, which was connected to the other about fear. So people don't come forward to talk in the context of their intersections with child welfare about their immigration status because families are worried about what might happen as a result of that. They feel precarious, they feel threatened with deportation at the extreme end and other things. And so fear really gets in the way. And then the lack of knowledge in the circumstance of individual young people, and fear is important there as well. And again, many different kinds of reasons for that fear, you know, anxiety about their own precarity and stability, anxiety about what their disclosures or their questions might mean for other people who they care about, and the stability and security of other folks in their family. So I think there are many, many reasons, and they are not straightforward. The only other thing I would say is that I think we are getting better at recognizing this. And I would say that I see it really profoundly in terms of how things happened for children that I was working with early days in my career, and the kinds of things that I see happening and available now. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Mary. That's fantastic. And actually, it really goes really nicely into our next question, which is directly for Monica about, the main thing, one of the key aspects of this project is the interest in engaging individuals who've had firsthand knowledge and experiences with the Canadian immigration system, as well as the child welfare system. So from your work as a peer champion with immigrant, refugee, and non-status women, what are some of the challenges that immigrant women face when they're involved with the child welfare system?
Well, refugee, non-status, and immigrant women in general, I'm going to be using this term very often, so I'm just giving you what it means. They face several challenges, not only when they are involved with the child welfare system, but within their everyday life. When they are involved with the child welfare system, many of them face challenges related, but also not limited to language barriers, social cultural differences, lack of guidance, lack of familiarity or awareness of the laws, stigmatization, prejudices, discrimination, and racism. Many of these women living in isolation, they don't have a family or a clear support system around them. They are most likely experiencing some form of family violence themselves. And also, even when they does not justify, it's understandable that some of them might only be reflecting that abuse into their children. Many of these women who are involved with the child welfare system could also be dealing with poverty, immigration issues, and even some legal processes at the same time. Here in Canada and in other self-called first world countries, there is a high expectation of the instant integration and quick assimilation of the language, culture, custom, and legislation. There is a clear ideology of the here versus there, with a dangerous tone of superiority and white savior. What the child welfare system and other organizations do not understand is that there are little different Canadas inside a big one. It all depends where you come from, your gender, the tone of your skin, your accent, your income, but it's more importantly, how Canadian you behave. Depending on this is how you will be treated, how your case will be handled, and how much support or understanding you will receive. The child welfare system needs to understand that most people bring children into this world to love them and take care of them, and that out of that love they come to, or they try to stay in Canada to give those children a better future, a better life, and that if they get involved with the child welfare system, it is the child welfare system obligations to offer support, but with real empathy and understanding that and also that they deserve to be treated with respect and dignity. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Monica. I appreciate that so much. Actually, I want to make sure that we all have an opportunity to hear from all the panelists, and especially with the powerful words that Monica just shared. I was wondering if Shaoli, I could ask you a question as a follow-up question to Monica's statement.
Of course.
And the question is really around what alternatives are there for people to talk about child abuse or family conflict without triggering the duty to report requirements. As Monica was saying, people bring their children into the world to love them and care for them. And when they face challenges and difficulties, what other options are available for them without triggering the duty report?
Yeah, Monica, I was so moved by your response. This is such an interesting question. I did a lot of my preliminary research with my team. So I manage support workers who are actually on the front line working with the women that we serve. And so I was asking them these questions. And I asked one of my support workers, Hiromi, about what alternatives we have. And the clear-cut, unfortunate answer is not that many. But the interesting thing about the question is it asks us what alternatives, could we foresee, could we brainstorm? And there's a couple of things that come in with the question. The first is, in my line of work, it depends. It depends if mom is separated from her abuser or the person who is being abusive towards her. Because if she is, it can be a little simpler for us to explore ways that we can support her if she's already become separated from him, figuring out where she wants housing, financial barriers, her immigration status when she's away from a dangerous situation. But if mom is still with the person who is abusive towards her, that can also pose a whole new set of challenges in terms of, it can be really scary to be in the middle of an abusive relationship and have to consider getting NCFD involved because, and I guess going forward, I should say, yeah, in BC, it's the Ministry of Child and Family Services. So I'll just shorten it to NCFD for us, or I can continue saying child welfare. It doesn't matter, however people prefer. But it just depends. I guess in terms of alternatives, the only other way to answer that question is to ask, like, well, how can we support these women in terms of offering them alternatives? Not many. We are organizationally and legally bound to report if we suspect that a child is enduring abuse or neglect. And so we can't ever encourage women to not report if they suspect that their child is being abused. But what we can do is offer them ways that we can make the process easier and less daunting. There's so much fear and isolation involved in the process of duty to report, like reporting and making a file with NCFD. All the way from like cultural competence to language barriers, all the way to fear of apprehension and then deportation. Like, to ask a woman who's in the middle of an abusive relationship to do that alone is a huge ask. And so I guess in a roundabout way, my answer is alternatives, not that many. Offering supports such as like, even just as easily as like translations, or really sitting down with women to let them know like what can be potential outcomes. And it's scary, but like we often need to go over worst case scenarios with women beforehand before they report, because no one wants to be surprised through this process. That's the last thing we want women to be, is to be blindsided by a potential outcome. And so sitting with them and saying like, these are potential alternatives, and like, let's talk about each one, and like, how do we feel about that? What can we do if A was to happen? What's something that we could do? What about B? Offering translators, working with women to like really help them understand. There's an interesting thing that I think happens with newcomers that I work with, where there is almost sometimes an implicit trust in our systems, because a lot of the women that come are coming from developing countries where there isn't an implicit trust in bureaucratic like systems. And there's this idea that when we come to the West, that, you know, bureaucracy is like non-existent, and that everyone is actually here, and that systems are efficient, and everyone is here to help you. So there is sometimes this kind of interesting relationship where we see women being like, well, maybe it's like, you know, there's like there's a hopefulness to being like, well, I can get people involved because the people are here to help me. And being a little more realistic in our conversations about duty to report, and saying like, you know, it's not about people not being here to help you, or like people not having your best interests at heart. It's just that these systems aren't built in a way where your interests really are their number one priority. So I guess, yeah, the question is an interesting one because it begs a lot of other interesting ethical questions. But these straightforward answers, unfortunately, not that many alternatives to duty to report, but lots of ways to work with women through that process to make sure it's not as painful as it is meant to be.
Thank you, Shaoli. No, that was a fantastic response. I actually have a follow-up question to your response, and then we'll go into the Q&A. You talk about not being the number one priority, right? The needs of these women. Why do you think the needs of these women have been rendered invisible, right? So what do you think contributes to the silence, you know, around child abuse or child welfare and gender-based violence service delivery, with specifically immigrants, refugees, and non-status women?
I think, well, Mary brought up something really interesting at the start of your answer, Mary. You said, you know, like, we know that there are silos that exist, you know, legally, structurally, we can recognize that. But what these women are living is like the intersection of that. So even though people don't realize that those silos exist, or that, you know, sorry, that they're not intertwined, right? People don't think that child welfare and immigration have an intrinsic, intimate relationship. And so we try to separate the two. Women are actually living that intrinsic relationship, you know, like that's their life and that's what they're having to go through. And I think there are so many reasons that they are silenced and that there is silence surrounding it. And I know, I'm not sure we have the most time right now, but I think that going off of basically what everyone else has said, it's just because we're trying to have a one size fits all approach. And I think that what we know about human beings and the way that society, a specific society that we've built, is that like one size fits all just does not work. We've known that for a long time, and we're continuing to learn, I think, ways in which it actually truly works against most people, and racialized immigrants happen to be a big social demographic. I think that it affects. I think it's, you know, I think it's a lack of cultural competence. I think it's a lack of wanting to be culturally competent. I think that it's systemic racism. I think that it's like Canada being a colonial project. There's so many reasons that I think that women experience silence or are erased in child welfare and immigration systems. Yeah.
No, thank you. Thank you so much. Mary, you had a comment. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, I kind of want to add just an additional layer on to all of that, which is to say that like one of the things that happens for us that I know we're not talking about today, but is that we really see the powerful ways in which children's information is discounted and adult information is preferred over that of children, even when you might objectively think that children are actually more reliable sources of information. So one of the things we see is young people coming forward and saying that they have, they're facing harm or they have needs, and being disbelieved or ignored or just sidelined or marginalized in some other way. And of course, this is all the more complex in the context where that young person might feel deeply responsible to, this other layer, this immigration layer of well-being of their broader family members, because although they might be feeling a sense of harm and looking for support, and they also feel loyal and love for parents. Children, I think we all are very, very aware that children love the people who might also harm them because of the sort of intensity and importance of those relationships. And so I think it's another layer of concern and young people. We have a specific project out directed at young people who have grown up in Canada and don't have status, and the myriad difficulties that are involved there. And when you layer on their own experience of violence, it's I think Shirley's comments are really relevant, and that sometimes childhood is actually another sort of layer of adversity or intersectionality that's got a big impact.